I hate how lopsided I always look on
Oh,
these
hold
because
on.
it's
There you go. How are you?
whatever. Can you hear me?
Yeah, I can hear you.
Yeah.
My thing
I can
was
hear
muted.
you. Oh, my volume must be down. Shit. Better.
Can you hear me?
Can you hear me? Yep.
Perfect.
Am I frozen? Okay, now I'm back. Okay. I like it.
Yes, perfect.
I don't like it. Oh my god. I'm lopsided. I don't like it. Hi, Tala. Can you hear us?
Yeah, can y'all hear
Yeah.
me?
Yeah.
Yep.
Also, sorry I didn't respond to the Canvas thing. Fun fact, I didn't have a phone for 4 days,
Oh, wow.
so I lived like an Amish person.
Well,
I
fun
saw a
fact.
whole bunch of Amish people on my flight back to Texas. I was like, y'all are allowed to do that?
Yeah,
I
like
mean,
that, you know that picture of Kim Kardashian where she's like a pilgrim?
Yeah.
yeah, Ethel Kane. Yeah.
Ethel Kane Court. Yeah. Ethel Kane. That's
Mm,
funny.
Me as fuck.
God. I was out sick for like 3 days, or whatever, and that derailed everything, surprisingly. So,
I have a assignment that I was supposed to be working on all semester for like what is it, humanities 202, like consumer society thing. I haven't started it and it's due on the 26th. It's 14 modules. Each module takes about an hour and a half.
oh wait, I think I was in the same class. It's for the consumer um
Society thing, yeah.
yeah, I started that the end of February and I just finished it like I want to say April 3rd. And like, oh my God, it felt like a weight being lifted off. I didn't have to worry about
I
it anymore.
bet I'm about to not do so well. It's pass fail, right?
Yeah.
Okay.
Wait, I think all the answers to that are on Quizlet.
Yeah, some of them are, yeah. Some of
Don't say
them.
that to me. That's like an honor code violation.
Oh, sorry.
It's okay.
None of the answers are on Quizlet.
None of
And
them.
even if they were, don't look there.
Never, never. I have to pay for Quizlet now. Hi, Connor. Hi, Alex. Hi, Amelia.
Hi,
Hello.
everyone.
Hi,
Hi.
guys. All
Okay,
right. I think that's all of us, right?
yeah. Are you guys
Yeah,
ready?
Mm-hmm.
that is right.
Okay. So question one, the origin section of Drutman's book, chapters 1 through 4, traces debates about the utility of political parties from the framers through the 80s in order to explain how we got to the current state of crisis in our American democratic experiment. Here he discusses the anti-partisans, the responsible partisans, and bipartisans. What does he identify as the merits and the weaknesses of each of these three traditional approaches to the paradox of partisanship?
Okay. Well, for that one, I kind of broke it up into like the three different categories. So like for the framers, the anti-partisans fears, I was like they did have merit when it came to like kind of fearing the two-party establishment. They didn't want tyranny and like all that to ensue. However, the weakness shown is the ideology that by having no parties, how would democracy work? Democracy is based on two opposing teams, really. So that's what I thought. And then I was like, responsible partisans weakness stems from just being a two-party system. That one was a little weak on my end. And then for bipartisan, I was like, bipartisan has merit and that it's a healthy democracy. We need opposing sides. However, the weakness is that it leaves many people stifled in their decision making because there's only two parties to choose from. So yeah.
I think like to add on to that, like we need like bipartisanship, but um like not to the point where the parties are like unidentifiable. Oh, also remember guys to cite page numbers because she's looking for that. Um, so the like I noticed like on like page like 86, like he like acknowledged that like there was a shift of the parties, but like he said that it is like a problem when like all of these parties like are indistinguishable, which I think is like the whole question he was kind of framing, at least the way I read it, was like, is that worse than what we have now?
I mostly pulled from like chapter 2 when doing this because I found a lot on like anti-partisans, responsible partisans, and bipartisans in that part. So like to start with like anti-partisans, on page 8 or page 42 technically of the book, um, he talks a lot about how in the early 1900s progressives start thinking about anti-partisanship. And he wrote, once everyone put country above party, expertise and common sense would align, and wisdom would prevail over petty greed. So I think he thinks partisanship has made governance bad, but the progressives failed for the same reasons that the framers failed, according to Drutman on page 43. Politics without parties to organize and structure conflict yields only chaos. Chaos is unsustainable. That's why parties always emerge to structure politics. So he's saying like conflict always comes back into politics one way or another. So parties always kind of have to emerge. So anti-partisanship just doesn't really work. And like it has its merits because like he wants everyone to put country above party, but it just doesn't really turn out that way.
I said something similar, Emma, and I also kind of pulled a lot from chapter 2. On page 51, I think he's kind of alluding to the paradox of partisanship when he says partisan conflict is to modern democracy like fire was to early human cave dwellers. It's essential to life, yet dangerous to its survival. Without it, democracy can't survive. And obviously we see like a theme of this throughout the book. And as you were talking about, like he doesn't say necessarily that anti-partisans are wrong, but that's kind of what he's alluding to, at least in my opinion. Like not wrong, but that's not realistic in a functioning democracy.
Like out of all the 3 options he gives, like it's probably the most unrealistic. Like he's saying it's like, yeah, it's a good idea, but like out of all the 3, it's like the most unfeasible.
Yeah, on page 39, he actually referred to it as like quote unreasonable.
So on page 31, he kind of refers to them as crippling public trust in the government. And that really was their biggest, in my opinion, their biggest weakness. Because I feel like the parties that don't, the parties that create the least amount of public trust in the government are the least achievable. Does that make sense? And in terms of bipartisan, kind of going off of what Emma said earlier, he described them as being failures of party responsibility, and that I feel like he just mainly spent a lot of time talking about weaknesses. And I think it was important that he touched on part of bipartisans being weak is that there's like such a deep-seated ideology of the 2 parties that coming to a compromise would be difficult to achieve. Yeah.
I kind of talked about that as well with the I think it was on page 37 for bipartisanship. He says it's not as great an achievement as not as a great achievement of consensus and stability, but as a failure of party responsibility. Like you said, Tala, democracy required vigorous competition between parties. And he talks a lot about how competition kind of, is essential to democracy. And I always thought that was an interesting point that he brought up. And then like on page 48 through 49, he talks about like feeble attempts at recreating partisanship, and how he says America is indeed a separated power system of governments. 2 strong overlapping parties will generate gridlock and dysfunction in the American party system. He describes efforts as futile, says on page 14, or is that 14 or more like 49, I guess. That partisanship or bipartisanship flourished because there was a genuine space for compromise when parties were loose or coalitions with significant ideological overlap. So I feel like he thinks bipartisanship with like, more ideological overlap, like you said, Tala, is like probably the way to go. like the four-party system. He mentions how it wasn't really like four parties, just a lot more combining ideologies. Connor, do you have anything you want to add?
I think you guys covered everything. Let's move on to the second question.
Okay. So which of the three do you think best describes the way you most often thought about American politics? Um, I just said I think bipartisanship, um, having two opposing parties has always been s- I have always seen as like the American way in politics. That's how um I think it's just been described to me from like civics all the way up until now. Democrats, Republicans are the leading face of American politics.
I said
I kind of, you can go ahead, seriously. Go ahead.
sorry. I said the pretty much the same thing. I grew up bipartisan. Like I always had a bipartisan take on politics because we always learn in school there's the Democrats, there's Republicans, and then eventually when you get old enough, they start talking about third parties and you start actually paying attention to the elections, but I don't really remember learning about them. I did talk about how I grew up in, like, whenever we did the bubble thing in class. Um, I grew up in a Republican household. Like my parents were always very like more towards the Republican candidates and that kind of stuff. They kind of shifted away as we're going to talk about it in the next question about like the shift between the Republican parties. But I grew up in a Democratic community. So it was always I always thought that was a very big kind of like juxtaposition and it almost forced my parents to kind of have to teach us about both sides because we're already exposed to both sides. So you can't really be just like strictly Republican or strictly Democrat.
I think that's like how a lot of people have been growing up nowadays. And it's really interesting how to see, like, when they become adults, like, where their opinion kind of lies and how exposure has done them a great service, in my opinion, because, like, the less exposure you get, I feel like the less educated you are. So I kind of said we're kind of on the responsible partisanship spectrum, not like 100%, but I feel like there are definitely like more divided parties and how we're just, like a definite two-party system at the moment. Um, and he describes like responsible partisanship as like people who are more in favor of like top-down parties, I think, more responsible and moderate. They want to cut out extremist outsiders groups. He says that on page 50, I think. He says it fails because of like on page 52 privilege competition. But our parties are stronger than ever, but the responsibility or responsible partisans are just like they think we're still too weak. So they keep like pushing it to be more separate. And I feel like that's kind of the direction we're heading. Like we're dividing the country even more by encouraging stronger two-party systems. But I don't know if it's like just as it is in the text as it is like, IR.
I agreed with Emma. Like had said that um we were responsible partisans, but my reasoning was a little different. Like I alluded to chapter 4 when he said that like responsible partisanship reaches this point where it's like a zero-sum game. And I feel like that's like a big chunk of his argument is what like we've become.
Yeah, especially like he was not to get too far in advance, but he was talking in future chapters about how like we went from the four party system to the two party system. And like, all of us on this call were born, probably in the early 2000s, or late 90s, and that was way after like the four party system ended. So I've always like thought of it as like the bipartisans and because you hear like, the two sides or the other side, so a lot of that kind of charged language.
Does anyone else have anything else to add?
I kind of just said the same thing. I grew up only really thinking about it in a bipartisan way, and responsible partisans and anti-partisans weren't something that I even considered or knew about until I started studying political science.
Yeah. I will say a
I
lot
think I
of
grew up
I'm sorry.
sorry. I
Go
feel like
on.
I grew up in like a very like liberal household and like I feel like my parents said a lot of negative stuff towards Republicans, especially because we kind of lived in a neighborhood like that. Um but like I feel like that made me a little more conscious of like bipartisanship and like, how like not to demonize either party like completely. I don't like the negativity that is brought to politics a lot of the time because of the party systems. So I feel like political science has definitely been kind of a gateway for that.
And like growing up outside of school, like within the house, I wasn't necessarily like politics wasn't a really big factor. I feel like my family kind of steered away from that because it was such a debated topic. Um so like within civics in school, learning bipartisanship and stuff. Like even now in this class, I'm learning a lot about the elections. So it's definitely interesting to see. But with that being said, do we want to move on to question two? Okay. So Drutman transitions from talking about the recent past in chapter 4 to the present in chapters 5 through 7, his contemporary crisis section, arguing that not so long ago, 1960s to 80s, we had a hidden four-party system that prevented the doom. He associates with our now cemented, intractable, fully sorted two-party system. What does he say previously explained the ability of the two parties to avoid the catastrophic levels of dysfunction that it experiences today?
He talked a lot
So-
of. Oh,
Oh,
sorry,
go
go ahead,
ahead,
Alex.
Connor. No, you can go because you haven't talked a lot.
Uh,
Not in a bad, I didn't mean that like in a bad way. Just like
You're
I've
good.
talked.
So he talks a lot about like racial and partisan realignments, and kind of like the transition, especially since like the 2000s. Like, one thing I found on page 114 that was interesting, 32% of Democrats in 2009 said racism is a big problem compared to 76 in 2017. And so there's a lot more like racially charged like language and feelings and opinions, over the last couple decades. And it just kind of another example to highlight how like we've kind of gone from like somewhat being able to compromise to just, really by two-party system. On page 109, they talked about a Republican who was refused to support a bill that he said like I would normally support it, but because it has Democratic support, especially from President Obama, that he couldn't support it. And the kind of subtext that I got there was, because a black president is supporting this, I can't support a bill because then my constituents would not reelect me. That was kind of like the subtle message I got there, but this kind of goes back to like how there's a lot of like racial realignments in our politics.
I had pulled like a little bit earlier from in the book. So like something I noticed like on page 91, he said like party leaders used to like lead with like a softer touch, and now it's kind of like like the party leader, some like representatives are viewing as like their boss, and it's like, oh, I don't want to like piss off my leader. Um, and also like they were able to lead with a softer touch because the parties were more like ideologically diverse. And then like another thing I had mentioned is that on page 71, he like specifically pinpoints a time when he talked about the 1968 Internal Democratic Commission that turned presidential nominations like over to the public. And I think like this was the first time, like while I disagree with it, why I kind of like started understanding his big beef with like public nomination processes.
I kind of struggled with, I think, what is this? Question three or question two? Or questions two and
Yeah.
three.
No, we're
That's
on the
what I
first
struggled
one.
with a bit. Yeah. So I kind of liked what you said though, Alex, about how party leadership has become kind of like really toxic and how people within the party will see like a party leader and be like, I don't want to piss off my boss. And that's kind of caused like a lot of people to be like really rigid in their beliefs and unchanging, and that does not allow for ideological overlap. I kind of said what I said before. He talks a lot on chapter 5, page 16 of chapter 5. I don't know. I was looking at the PDF, like instead of like the actual page numbers. He says a lot about the 2010 era of politics. Sorry, and how the two-party system just kind of like, no one wants to have any ideological overlap. And I think a lot of what you said, Connor, about like having a black president definitely contributed to that. He just says there's no compromise, no overlap. I kind of lost my place. I'm sorry, but I did really like what y'all said. Sorry.
Well, just to add on that too, like for kind of an example more like towards the beginning of the book. So I'm also losing my train of thought very much today. But he also talks about on page 73 about how as national issues became more and more prevalent in like voters' minds, they cared more about the party labels than the candidates themselves. So like kind of going back to when we had the four-party system, you could have like Bill Clinton, for example, he was a Democratic governor in Arkansas. That would not happen often today. And then you had Republican governors of New York and things like that. But then, even when the further we got through our politics, voters started to care more about these national issues, even if like, your school board representative has no control over, you know, different things at the national level, they will vote up or down, just based on your party affiliation, even if things you have no control of. And so he kind of talks about that more on page 73, and I think that also kind of plays a part in this question.
I agree. Like a big part of kind of what Alex said, how Drutman, I forget what page it was on, but Drutman said that party leaders used to kind of like govern with a softer hand. I forget exactly how you said it. But like even now, with Marjorie Taylor Greene trying to remove the Speaker of the House because he's trying to like actually pass legislation and is agreeing with Democrats too much and is like betraying their party. Like that just shows, like I feel like a lot of political leaders now feel like a responsibility to just be strictly loyal to their party rather than actually pass legislation regardless of who it's harming. And it's created this like huge gridlock, which Drutman doesn't directly address in the book, but is kind of explained through the different theories that he discusses.
I think that's interesting because, like, why not pass legislation? Like, you were sworn into office under the assumption that you were there to aid the people that you were representing, and like, if it's good for us all, it's good for me as well. So like, just the gridlock that party ideologies, sorry, like creates is just threatening, honestly, just American democracy as a whole. Like, we're not getting anything passed. People are suffering as a result, and like, as someone who represents a large group of people, they should want what's best for their people, and not passing legislation is just kind of ridiculous at that point.
I kind of said basically the same thing, and this kind of goes into the question that comes after this, but in chapter 4, Drutman talks about the impact of governance, and he talks about zero-sum politics having significant implications on that, and how bipartisan cooperation has become increasingly rare over the years, and it's continuing to get rarer and rarer as like time goes on. But I think, and that one, do y'all mind if we go into the second question on part 2? So he says, what does he mean when he argues that today's crisis has been spurred by the nationalization of identity politics and culture war politics? I think it's because he talks about, I really pulled from chapter 4 and chapter 5 for this, that like the impact of governance and changes in congressional leadership. I think that we've kind of seen a shift away from political leaders being public servants to now serving their own needs. Like they're just running for re-election. They're not actually running to change the country. And that's why they're not passing legislation. That's why you have people like Marjorie Taylor Greene that are just in there for like views. Like to me, they're clickbait representatives. They're not actually doing anything. And if you look at them more specifically, Drutman doesn't go into really like examples of current people, but I did want to talk about how he brought up Jim Jeffords's party switch. And I think that really just highlights that people aren't doing it for the country anymore. They're just doing it for themselves. He kind of felt that he had to leave the Republican Party under George Bush because there was no space for him as a moderate Republican. And I feel like in the Republican Party, there should be, in any party, there should be space for everybody,
That part was so interesting to me, the Jeffords part, because like him just leaving the party, I feel like that was a moment of self-awareness that we could really use today from a lot of people. I think on the second part of question 2, I feel like the focus on 2010 is so interesting because that is definitely a part of like the modern kind of political switch. And he talks about how the Democrats became like a party of diversity and cosmopolitan values, and one party, the Republicans, became kind of like the party of white Christian America and traditional America, and how that kind of creates the party identity and national identity, and making it so dangerous and hard to resolve. And honestly, I don't know if we could ever go back to a point where, like, national identity and party identity don't play like a huge role in politics.
I think a big part of that divide that you were talking about, Emma, is like on page 98, he was talking about, which I never really thought about till I read the book, about the like regional divide between like views. And I think like we hear this a lot, like you'll hear people in the South being like, oh, those stupid liberal Californians, or those, stupid liberal Northerners. And then you'll hear like the people up north be like, oh, the South they're idiots, they're Republicans. And I feel like when they're like not actually seeing each other and talking to each other, and they're just like divided across the country, like it's making that divide worse.
Yeah, and I think I forgot to write down the page number for this, but I also recall him talking about how as like culture war issues and like values issues became more prevalent in like voters' minds, it also kind of spurred more partisanship because like if the two parties are debating about spending bills, like the Republicans want to spend 500 million on education, Democrats want to spend 100 or a billion, they can kind of compromise in the middle. Like that's a tangible way to compromise. You can't really compromise on value issues. Like you can't say, well, only this percentage of people get marriage equality. Like there's not as much like compromise there, so it kind of by nature makes it like one or the other. And so like as those issues, especially again like going back to like the election of President Obama, I think that like really started to put those issues more front and center, for better or for worse.
Shall we do the third part? Okay, can you think of any examples to support his characterization of today's toxic politics, and or do you think he's overlooking anything important in his discussion of where today's toxicity comes from? Personally, I don't. The one example I thought of was Marjorie Taylor Greene, because obviously her entire existence is just toxic. But I wanted to mention, and he talks about Ralph Hall in chapter 4. So he was a Democratic congressman from Texas, and he switched to the Republican Party so that he could be reelected in a more, because he lives in a more conservative district of like Northwest Texas, I think. Yeah, and in 2004 he tried to he just wanted to get reelected, so he moved to the conservative ticket even though he started as a Democrat. So I just felt like that was a really good sum of toxic politics.
I didn't have much to say on that little question because I couldn't think of like any like big examples other than just like everything obvious that I knew everyone else would probably say. And I couldn't think of anything he'd overlooked really. But I thought that was interesting. The fact that he switched to like conservative. I feel like that kind of just points out the fact that people only really look at the R and the D on certain ballots and don't really actually know who they're voting for. And that's kind of dangerous in terms of party identity as well.
Yeah, one of the examples, and this is not exactly something he overlooked, but one that he talked about on page 121 was in 2016, Hillary Clinton ran a record high number of attack ads while also running a record low number of like more so positive or like policy focused ads. And I found this like personally interesting because like I remember like thinking at the time that her greatest strength as a candidate was how well she knew like the ins and outs of like policies and government, like how government works and institutions. Like that was like her greatest skill set. And they really, I think, dropped the ball in highlighting that to voters with like, and them making the decision that they thought voters were going to respond more to just ads going after the Republicans and after Trump versus like what Hillary Clinton and the Democratic a Democratic White House would look like in terms of policy. I found that interesting that they thought that was the better move. It kind of just goes back to again like highlighting like how negative our politics have turned.
I thought it was like really interesting that on like page 112 he had mentioned the like battle of the speaker, And obviously, like, this book was written before like even Paul Ryan and Kevin McCarthy, but I feel like by mentioning what happened with John Boehner, like little did he know he was like painting a picture of what would also happen with the next two speakers. Um, and I think maybe it was Tala who was talking about um like the whole idea, like Marjorie Taylor Greene, like it's becoming a pattern where like people are like not happy with the speakers like whenever they like start working with the other side at all. And then I think I actually did find somewhere where I would have liked him to talk about more. And like on page 51, he really briefly alluded to the fact that like from the mid 1960s and the mid 1980s, like the parties, like he kind of described them as like this happy medium between not like too indistinct nor too distinct. But he never really elaborated on what they were doing well and like how that could be replicated in this time period. Maybe he does that in the solution section, but like I feel like he was like, hey, this is great, but then like we didn't really get any other information.
All right, shall we move on? Okay. Question 3. Chapter 7 discusses the normative importance of the fundamental democratic norm of shared fairness in a healthy democracy before chronicling some of the modern threats to that norm that create what he calls a doom loop. Excuse me, a reinforcing feedback loop, a death spiral, a kind of trap where once you get stuck inside, it's tricky to spring loose. What are some of the violations of this norm of shared fairness that Drutman finds so deleterious to the legitimacy of democracy, and why does he think that their existence leads to a vicious cycle that can only be broken by drastic measure?
So on page 120 or 172, he says that parties must agree to disagree, but they also must implicitly agree on the limits of disagreements. And at least with our current parties, I just don't think that's something that they would ever come to an agreement on. Like we were talking about in other questions, it's just this constant cycle. It's the whole theme of the book, but they're like, I don't know how you set a boundary for that. Especially when like Tala said earlier, like tick or clickbait, I don't know what you called it, clickbait legislators or something. I thought that was a really good point because I think that just feeds into it more and more, and these people aren't like fulfilling their civic duty, so they have no reason or motivation to wanna like set a boundary for, okay, we can argue to this point, but then we have to come to a consensus eventually. I think a lot of them like have no true motivation to do that because they just are staying in office like for shits and giggles.
I think the biggest point of like the unfairness like came up. I didn't even write this down. It just like popped into my head during that one section with the Wisconsin gubernatorial. I'm probably saying that wrong. Election where the new governor was elected and it was a Democrat, and they made all this legislation being like he can't interfere more than to this extent. And I thought that was so wild because like the statement one of these people gave was like a kid throwing a tantrum. It was like it's not fair, it's not fair, it's not fair. I'm not getting my way, so he can't get his way. And I feel like that just like was the most immature, unresponsible thing anyone in either party could have done. Um, Drutman on chapter 7, page 7 says, now in an era of toxic politics, if everything is unfair to somebody, then who's left to judge? Continued cries of unfairness make it impossible to distinguish real unfairness from mere trade-offs among competing but legitimate values. That's like page 163. Partisans of both sides now buy into the rhetoric of electoral fairness. So like the major problem is democracy depends on both sides accepting electoral outcomes as legitimate. He believes polarization just makes all of this much worse, and the distrust and unfairness just make polarization worse, creating vicious cycle. It's like really self-explanatory. Like the doom loop, everyone like points fingers, and then like we just go back to square one. Overall, I didn't think it needed like much explanation, but I think the details that Drutman provided were nice.
Yeah.
I think also going off of Wisconsin, Emma, like I think it was the same state where he had mentioned that they like won the state assembly popular vote, but like the like Democrats didn't have the majority because they had like messed up the state legislator, which like is like I think I might be jumping around a little because it might be in another question, but he talks about in the book how people are like so personally passionate. It's getting to this point where they feel like they have to be unfair to like protect themselves. Which is why I think like it's really important to consider that like towards the end of the chapter on like 171, he acknowledges that like this is really scary because it's hard to like build back up peacefully once like democracy's been broken down.
It's kind of hard not to point fingers in this day and age and like kind of assume either party is doing anything like untoward. Even if you're like a Democrat and you can like even have some distrust in your own party, and that's like been very dangerous for us. Like there's no unity amongst any parties, and that's just like to be like it's because like yeah, we have polarization, so like a giant two-party system that just doesn't trust each other. Then there's so much distrust within the parties, like with Marjorie Taylor Greene, the Speaker of the House. Like we're not going to get any work done, and it's not going to be like a peaceful resolution at this point.
So, fun fact about her. This past week I got to walk by her office, and keep in mind there's a lot of things happening in DC right now. Like the Japanese president and the Indonesian prime minister are here for Indo-China relations discussions with the president of the United States. And there are a lot of important legislation being and a lot of like voting being done, and she has a giant sign outside of her office on a whiteboard that says there are only two genders, period. Look it up, period. Trust the science, period. And inside of her office was so loud and so chaotic that a representative from Kentucky is in the office across the hall, and their staff had to like shut the door because they're actually working on passing legislation in there, and she's in her office wearing her MAGA hat screaming about how there are only two genders. So all this stuff going on in Washington and you're not doing anything. You're sitting around, you're doing nothing. And that I think is truly the embodiment of the doom loop. And I would have loved to see what Drutman says about, I wish he would have talked about her. I wish this book would have come out then.
Yeah, wow. That's like I don't like to demonize mental illness because I like me and like a whole bunch of family members and friends like like I don't demonize it obviously, but like there's like some sort of like level where like you cannot be in office at that point. That's just like an insane reaction to anything. That's irresponsible for her to even be in office.
I agree.
You guys
All right.
ready to move on, or is someone else? Sorry, go ahead.
I was just about to say that. Should we read the next question? Okay. You weren't required to read chapters 8 through 10, the solution section, but in other parts of the text, he alluded to a number of potential solutions that you may be familiar with. 3 of the ideas involve the following: A, adopting ranked choice voting; B, expanding the size of the House of Representatives; and C, eliminating congressional primary elections. Based on what you know about these ideas from class lectures, other parts of the book, outside knowledge, or research, do you think any of them could help restore the norm of shared fairness that Drutman deems so crucial to the electoral democracy's health, and why? So I chose A, ranked choice voting. I thought that would make the most sense. In terms of adopting the size of the House of Representatives, from a financial standpoint, I don't see it happening. And then also, like, where do we stop, Plus, I feel like a lot of people are not really interested in politics, and they don't want more politicians. They don't want more to worry about, more names, more people to elect. And then I didn't really think that eliminating the congressional primary election would really be more helpful than ranked choice voting. And if we could only choose one, but I am very shocked that the Electoral College was not mentioned, and why that's not a thing to bring in fairness.
Right. Like I feel like
that-
that's always the most common thing people are always criticizing.
That would have been my personal choice, because I just feel like, I mean, we've seen 2 elections in our time of just being alive where the president who won did not win the popular vote, but only won because of the Electoral College. I just feel like that's a loophole. But when we did the ranked choice voting activity in class, I thought it was the most fair, and that way, at least if you don't get to vote for the person that you actually want to, at least your vote will count towards something or someone that you deem is also appropriate.
I completely agree with everything you said. But I just wanted to add, like, I thought that removing the primary elections was not only like unhelpful, but I honestly think it's really dangerous. Like, I can't think of a way to piss off voters more than saying you no longer have control over who your party's nominee is. Like I just feel like that would result in this massive like revolt. Like, and we already see like people like pissed when people are doing like conventions instead of primaries. Which I think, and like we know that some parties do like conventions to like create loopholes. Like so like the candidate who would win the popular vote wouldn't win, and it would be picked differently.
Yeah, I agree. I don't like I understand his arguments for like why public primaries shouldn't exist and party leaders should have more control, but I don't know, maybe it's just like a generational thing. Like I think, I believe in democracy and that includes over who my party's nominating. And just because I'm not a party boss does not mean I shouldn't have to say who, our party's nominee is. So I don't yeah, I think it end up pissing off voters and it's also like a really great opportunity for a lot of people to get involved on a lower stakes, kind of like, an entry level kind of way, and get them more knowledgeable about the process, and kind of building the bench. So if anything, I think primaries actually help democracy, but that's my hot take. Um, I also like really, yeah, I agree with ranked choice voting, but I also really agree with expanding the size of the House, mainly because the last time it was expanded, the population was a different number. And so like, throughout history, the size of Congress has constantly been changing to adjust for that. And setting it a cap at I think it's 435 for the House. It hasn't changed, and I think last time it was changed was like in the late 1900s. And like we have areas now where in like more rural areas in Wyoming and like different like rural states, you have one member of Congress representing like 500,000 people, but then in other areas one member of Congress is representing almost over a million. And if we were to expand the size of the House, it would allow for more access, I feel like, to people's representatives, instead of representing like I think technically it's supposed to be around 750,000 per member of Congress, but you know when you're locked in at 435, it's kind of hard to maintain that. Um, but if you knock that down, so there's less area for representatives to cover, less people, it gets them more access. So the representatives get out there more in the community, and I think that might. Sorry, I'm having a very word salad brain kind of day. I think you guys get the point.
I agree, Connor. I like out of all three of these, I think that expanding the size of the House of Representatives would be the most beneficial, but I also think that ranked choice voting is probably more realistic, and in an ideal world we would have both, but that's not necessarily realistic again. Even if we only expanded it like a little bit just to make it slightly more fair, and we talked about when we read the op-ed, like it would better reflect diversity, like there's a multitude of different reasons why it's beneficial. And then also to Alex's earlier point, I also thought that, and Paula said this as well, but eliminating the primaries would kind of harm democracy more than do good. I guess I can kind of see Drutman's argument for it, but at the same time, I don't think it would really be beneficial.
To me,
I kind of like what Sorry, I kind of liked what Tala and Alex said. I think ranked choice voting sounded like the most realistic overall. And I really liked how that played out in class, especially for like local and state elections, because that's something that directs our lives like more directly, or impacts our lives more directly. Sorry. And it bring back the kind of fairness, I suppose, to politics. I am kind of on board with getting rid of primary elections, but only for like congressional districts, if that makes sense. Because in my local election, we had two really good Democratic nominees and two not so nice people who were running for Republican nominees. And there was like a man and a woman running for the Democratic seat, or for like the nomination, and the woman won, but then she had this like terrible scandal happen to her. She had some stuff leaked and it was like really nasty politics at play, and she lost by like a very small margin, but she still lost. And I feel like that scandal had like a lot to do with like the people who didn't vote for her. And I wonder if that would have been different if we had two Democratic people on there and two Republican people on there, with more people like who voted for the other Democrat over the two Republicans. um but I don't think that that would work for presidential primaries. I feel like give the people their voice in that area. Or maybe it's just not as important depending on like the election year. Like we all knew that Biden was going to be the Democratic nomination this year, and then we all knew that Trump was probably going to be the Republican nomination. So some of it didn't really make sense, but the ranked choice voting made the most sense.
I think like it's really hard to take like Susanna Gibson's election and make that like the standard of like an election, because like I think like there were obviously like Schuyler Van Valkenburg won the precincts that she lost. So the people who were voting for him were voting against her. And it's like a suburb that's like, you know, they're probably going to lean Democrat, but like if someone has a porn scandal, you know, the suburban parents aren't going to go out and vote for them. And I feel like that's what happened. I think like if they run another candidate, like the Democrats will win in a landslide, like, which is why I think it's really hard to like take that one election and like make that like an argument for like eliminating primaries.
I agree, Alex. I worked on Skylar's campaign, and the whole situation was really unfortunate because she was actually a really good candidate. But it was an oversight, like obviously by the entire team. And I think they were like, I don't want to speak on their behalf because we worked kind of in part with their campaign, but I think they were contemplating having her like step down from the election. I don't know what the formal term for that is. And it is interesting because that was like that district's focus is like really big on education and like families and stuff. And I think that played a big part on why she lost. I think had she been in like maybe in Northern Virginia or somewhere else, she may have still won.
I think that's a good point. I don't know if I articulated my point well enough because I'm also having a bit of a word salad day, like Connor said. Um, I did think what the Democrats did in that situation because I watched Schuyler Van Valkenburg was like a teacher at my school and his campaigns have always played out very well in my opinion. Um, so I did think what the Democrats did in that situation was honestly pretty fair. Because I feel like they didn't like abandon her, but they also like it was a very complicated situation overall, and it shouldn't be like the poster child for primary elections. So that's my bad.
I do just want to point out too, like if I don't, and not to minimize what we've been talking about for that election, but like I know we're kind of off topic at the moment, but the district itself was very different partisan wise. Like it was I think the difference in the 2022 elections was like less than half a percentage point between the two parties, whereas Van Valkenburg's district there is a 10-point spread. So like going into it, it was way more competitive than Van Valkenburg's race. So like I'm not sure how um like it relates to primaries necessarily of like picking a candidate who has potential scandal in the future. So just worth
They
pointing
both
out.
have like interesting ethos as well. Like he's a teacher and she's what is it, a nurse practitioner. So like I think that definitely has something to do with like our district because like where we live, it's like I wouldn't. It's a good mix of like Democratic and Republican, and honestly, it can change up every year. Um, so overall, it's just like a weird place for elections.
All right, you guys ready to move on to the last question? All right, I can read it. The introduction of the book includes a section called "Why I Wrote This Book." Therein, Drutman writes that when I see a dysfunctional systems, I always think there ought to be a better way. He presents his credentials by reminding us that he is a quote political junkie and a political scientist, and that in the research for his book, he studied democracies across the globe and revisited the history of our own country's framing. Um, Later in chapter 2, he tells us about other political scientists in the 1940s and 50s who saw a problem with the way American parties operated. However, he argues that in hindsight, their solution actually exacerbated today's crisis that he seeks to fix. Given this admission about the fallibility of political scientists of the past, how much weight do we think? Do you think we should give Drutman's own arguments? I promise I can read.
I can start. So I said that political science is a social science, and any social science research is going to be a little bit different than a traditional science research because the smallest action can really influence the outcome, especially when you're researching people and human behavior. Because at the end of the day, that's what this is. I think we can give him we can give his arguments weight because he's obviously a scholar in his field and his research is backed up and he presents like valid information. But I do think that political science is very opinion based, and he definitely throws his opinion throughout the book. So I think really everything that is said can be taken with a grain of salt because political scientists back then probably didn't predict, like in the early ones, did not predict what policy would look like today. And I think on page 117, he paints Donald Trump and how there's a resentment narrative around him. And he kind of describes him as less in a less than dignified way. And I understand that that's a common perception, but it's not. The point I'm trying to make is that he's not without his own opinion. Like he does insert his own views and his own beliefs into his research. But I think it's always evolving, and I think the quantitative research that he did is backed up, so we can at least give him some credit for that.
Yeah, I like what you said, Tala. I would give his like research and like opinions as much weight as I would anyone else who has his credentials and experience. And I think you can't take any one social scientist thoughts and opinions on things by itself. You have to use them as collective with what everyone else is saying in the field. And so if we take his work and combine it with other political scientists and social scientists, and try to find where the, kind of consensus is, I think that's how we move forward. But, I will leave it out there.
I kind of like what Tala was saying. Sorry about my face. I wasn't like making a face at what you were saying. Someone's making noise outside my door. I felt bad. But I kind of like what you were saying about like, combining political science work. I kind of wrote down that I feel like the past is the past and the present is the present, and like we'll never really know if Drutman's argument like has any legitimate weight unless we can put it into action and prove it correct or false. I'm sure political scientists of the past thought they were doing what was best for their time period and what made most sense for them, just as the framers did. They pulled from inspiration, as Drutman said, kind of like what they knew at the time, like a lot of stuff during the Enlightenment. Like literally we quote Locke all the time with life, liberty, pursuit of happiness, all that. And we just kind of have the luxury of learning from history and basing our theories off what we think worked well and worked poorly. Drutman kind of does the same, in my opinion. He says that we can change the political rules and reorder the political system at the end of chapter 7, but that would practically like send us back to square one with like the framers. So in hundreds of years, we could be put under the same microscope that we're putting him under and putting the framers under, and we'll be dissected with our theories and criticized just the same. So like time would only tell, really. So I don't think we can like say his arguments lend much weight unless we actually like give it some time and put it.
I agree with you all. I was also like I think he's right in saying there's a problem, which like APSA was also right in saying there was a problem in 1950, but like was like his solution right? Like I don't know. But like I think like I was a little shocked at how taken aback he was like by this question in class. Like he low-key seemed kind of like offended. And like I don't get that. Like I'm sorry, but like if you're arguing this about like previous like people in the field, like you should like accept it like for your own research.
Well, I think I might have interpreted the question a bit wrong. Um, I said like when it comes to Drutman and his ideas, they may hold some weight. He's advocating for more parties that could give citizens more options and feel more represented. However, implementing the idea sounds better in theory more than anything. Realistically, he's talking about changing the entire kind of framework of the political parties and just the system. So that will be no easy feat. There's also no guarantee that the multi-party system will work. I mean, it might just like dissolve back into those two parties again. Um, but based on everyone else's answers, I just think I might have interpreted the question a bit wrong. So
You're good, Emma. I think you were for a second, and then you're back. Sorry. Go ahead, Tala.
Oh, I was gonna say, are we ready? for the next one? Also, I thought it was a good take.
Oh, thank you.
I mean, the questions are very like long and a little convoluted, so I also had some trouble with them.
I
Um,
was Stacy because I was on medication trying to do all this. So
yeah. Okay. Do you buy his argument that the problem is as serious and or as intractable as it is today? I said yes. I think he makes a lot of good points about the two-party system being ingrained into the American political sphere. And because of that, we're stuck in a doom loop. I think we're seeing polarization more than ever, especially right now. I think the only thing uniting the country, or at least the younger people in the country, is the need for completely new presidential candidates. Just like the only thing that I feel like Republicans and Democrats across the board can agree on is that we just want scratch the whole thing and start over again, you know? And then on page 158, he kind of talks about how if both sides, like both legislators and members of Congress, are disagreeing about what fair is, then democracy as a whole is in trouble. And I agree, you know, if especially now what we're seeing with what the Democrats believe is fair for immigration and what the Republicans believe is fair is two completely different things. And I feel like once the democracy is in trouble, because if you can't agree on what's best for humanity, then how are you going to agree on what's best for the country?
I think the
think-
problem is definitely.
Oh, go
Amelia,
ahead.
you can go. I've been talking too much. Go ahead.
No,
Yes,
it's okay. Okay, well, I also agreed, and I didn't even, maybe I'm just like a pessimist in this regard, but I didn't even really need him to like sell his argument to me to agree with it. Like, I think the polarization that we see today is pretty obvious, and maybe that's just because we're political science students and we're like reading about it constantly. But he makes really good points, and I don't necessarily buy all of his solutions, but I think they're a good starting point, and he makes a good argument and has like with all of his quantitative data and like the historical context, he makes a good argument that we need to find a solution even if it's not his. So I guess I agree with that.
I definitely think it's a serious situation and kind of intractable. But I think there are elements that are making the severity much worse than it actually is. Like, I feel like polarization is always going to be a problem. I feel like it was a problem in the past, it's going to be a problem now. But I feel like if you took out kind of what Tal is saying, like the fact that we need, I think my network connection's unstable. Let me know if like y'all can't hear me. But if we took out something like, you know, the presidents and the fact that we like need new president nominees. I said Trump and his Legion of Doom kind of 100% perpetuate toxic partisanship and have made it worse. People like Marjorie Taylor Greene have definitely made it worse. And I don't want to say that like the squad like on the left has made it worse, but I feel like that's just kind of a reactionary response to a lot of the negativity on the far right side.
I want to say it made it worse.
I want to say it made it worse. Yeah.
Yeah,
I-
definitely like making
yeah.
your name like the squad or something like that. It feels very.
It's
I think
again,
there's very tolerable members of the squad. Like I will say, like, I'm not gonna lie, like when I first saw AOC as a candidate, I was like, how is this person like an elected official? But like I feel like she's made a lot of progress and has now become like very sensible and like a like a realistic progressive. I think there's other members who like I'm like, what are you doing? I just wanted
Right.
to
I feel like they kind
Oh.
of grow into politics and kind of become more sensible people. Like you can be very young and like, you know, start to learn. But I definitely agree with what you're saying. Sorry.
Yeah,
To you.
I just wanted to add that I agree with you all, and I really like a quote he said on like 168, which goes back to what we were talking about. Like I think I mentioned this with Wisconsin, like when he said that over decades, like partisans have gone from being skeptical to being like distrustful and from disagreeing with to detesting each other. And I think like that's really like what makes it worse is it's no longer like, oh, like if I vote this person, they're going to enact a bad policy that I disagree with. It's like if I vote for this person, they're going to do something that like negatively impacts my life and it's going to be like the end of the world.
Yeah, I mean, I agree it's a serious problem. Even just like if I think about it from like when our generation started paying attention to politics, like I started paying attention more so like in middle school and like high school, and just kind of seeing, you know, again like from the time Obama was first elected in 2008 to where it's at today, it's like we've been partisan the entire time, but it's been like getting worse and worse. Like going back, because like one of the examples Drutman gives in chapter 5, page 210, like the Republicans, or John Boehner, when they were running for in the midterms in 2010, said that they would take a zero tolerance to Obama's agenda if they retook the House. And other Republicans were using similar language, and then got to the point where then just a few years later, their own Republican Party was pushing out John Boehner as Speaker for then Paul Ryan to take over, who then retired a few years later. So it's like even in that regard, it's getting worse. But then, we think about all the things that were happening back then, and now we're getting to the point where, a literal insurrection happened in 2020 because of the outcome of an election in a very hyper partisan environment. To now, within a 2-year time span, a slim Republican majority has had two speakers that both took several rounds of voting, which is both instances were historic. And we're at the point where we might even have a third speaker if Marjorie Taylor Greene and other people get their way. And so it's like the partisanship has always been there, at least since we've started paying attention to politics, but it's been getting worse and worse. So I think it kind of just goes to highlight, how serious of an issue this is.
All right. Any last thoughts? All right, last
Did
one.
we already? Oh, sorry. I was going to ask if we already did the last one, but go ahead.
No, not yet. Do you think that his proposed solutions would work if enacted? Do you think it's realistic to talk about these proposals as if they could be enacted, and why? I think his proposed solutions are good. I mean, like, again, back to the earlier chapters on page 54, he talks about how removing the constraint of two parties would be good. If there was a multi-party system, the polarization between the parties would not be paralyzing. But I also think that it's not very realistic to talk about demolishing the two-party system because, again, all of this stuff is just so ingrained in American politics. People are not very amenable to change. Also the whole point of the book is how we're stuck in a loop and we're basically doomed. And I think we would need a major event like 9/11 scale x10 to change the two-party system, to really kind of show us that we can't have this because it's just so congressional.
Yeah. And
There
I
are definitely moments of unity like that.
Yeah.
Go ahead, Amari. Go ahead, seriously.
No, you're good. So I said I do think his proposal could have helped maybe a decade ago. However, maybe like I should push that back like so back further than a decade. But I said with the advent of social media and people like Trump already having held office, it would be much harder for bipartisanship to kind of swing back to like that fairness thing. Like it's not impossible, but like you said, Talia, it would be extremely hard. Like there would probably need to be something huge, catastrophic to just bring people kind of together in a way. But it's been like what we have now with polarization, that's been building for like years now. That's kind of hard to break down.
I think
I agree. Sorry, real quick, 'cause I have to run to class, so like I'll just speak and I have to hop off. But yeah, I mean, I kind of agree with what you guys are saying. I do think there's a path for some of these, but the path is kind of narrow, at least at the moment. I typically am like a realist and kind of a pessimist, but like on this, like I think as our generation kind of takes more and more hold of um the voting makeup of the country, I think it might make it a little bit easier to enact some of these. Especially too, like I think the better strategy is to start enacting these on the local and state level first, because then voters get more used to the idea. And honestly, like state and local elections have lower barriers of entries for candidates who might want to enact these types of policies. And so if you start there, getting voters used to it, combined with other factors, I think it makes it easier in the long run. It also would help too to see like, okay, after 5 years of ranked choice voting and, expanded legislatures, like does that they can do studies and see if it actually helps so we don't go too far in the wrong direction. But Anyway, I have to hop off. Sorry to be rude, but I have to go to class. But bye, guys. Thanks.
I like, if I'm being honest, the only thing read from the whole book that I was like, I could see this happening is ranked choice voting. Um, and like even that, like I don't think it's realistic because like Maine started 6 years ago and it never really caught on as a trend. And like actually like Youngkin just vetoed a ranked choice voting bill. So like I don't really see that happening. Like a lot of his solutions I think are like really not gonna happen, like getting out of two parties, like ending primaries altogether. Like I just don't see any of that happening.
I agree, Alex. Even like what Connor was saying, starting from like the local elections and moving up, I don't know that it would necessarily catch on because the people that are the most active in local elections are the people that are already aware of these policies and like are probably already advocating. I don't want to like assume, but are more aware and probably already want these. So I just don't know, like, I don't, while I agree that ranked choice voting is the most realistic, I also don't really see it happening anytime soon.
I kind of like what Tala said about the country being kind of too inflexible right now to make any sort of change. It could work small scale, like Connor was saying. I do kind of agree with that part. I feel like that's the only real way to see if it will make any impact. But like not even just lawmakers, but voters. Oh wait, I'm hearing feedback, sorry. I feel like voters would also be very like anxious about this sort of thing. Like there's too many uninformed or misinformed voters. I feel like conspiracy would probably run rampant. New weird factions would probably appear. I feel like it'd just all be a little too much at the moment. Like maybe in the distant future, but
I think there are just a lot of basic issues that the country is really stuck on, and we're having a hard time kind of getting off of them. If that makes sense, like we can't even agree on abortion rights, and I don't see us changing voting anytime soon. Or the party structure that we've had since James Madison was around.
Yeah, and
Right.
even in parties there's that disagreement.
like
Oh. Are you there, Emma?
I was gonna, but I feel like my bandwidth is like acting up. I was just gonna say like it's kind of hard to imagine it because there are people like Mitch McConnell who want to get rid of like interracial marriage, even though he's in interracial marriage. Like, there's no way we can change anything about voting if we can't even agree on like civil rights and human rights.
Yeah, and I was just saying I don't think it'll change like as a whole because there's even that disagreement within parties. Like even like with the Republicans, like they call each other rhinos and like, so I feel like if you can't even be in one coalition like as a party, you're not going to be in like the country is not going to agree as a whole.
All right.
Do you think she'll be mad that we're ending early?
We started a few minutes early.
Oh yeah, that's true.
Started a little bit before 1. Oh,
Emma, that is real,
yes.
sadly.
Yes, he is the commencement speaker. He's not for the
Oh
poly.
my gosh, you couldn't think of anyone better.
Well,
Like,
I think
obviously
it
not.
rotates the state. Like I think they rotate the state schools.
yeah,
But
his
he's gonna get
birthday-
protested at VCU. Like I don't know what he's thinking.
Obviously,
He was
like, do they
he was
know
protested at
VC's
Virginia
college?
Tech.
Yeah.
If Tech did not want him.
We're
Yeah,
not
they
gonna
need
want him.
him.
Do you know who VCU is?
Student government released a statement saying that it's like basically insulting that they
Yeah.
would bring him here.
I
I
mean,
saw
like,
that. That's like the whole thing. I saw.
Student government's kind of a joke though. Like they have their little internal elections and like, the girl who runs it is so extra. Like I'm like,
you're talking
like,
about Penelope?
no, I love Penelope. I'm talking about Joe.
Oh, I'm so
She's in
scared of Penelope.
don't be. She's in one of my classes and Joe's like always like, I'm the student body president. And I'm like, yeah, because you got all your senators to elect you. Like no one voted for you in the student body. Sorry, I should not say that like on this recording for class.
Wow,
I apologize, Dr. Reckendorf.
Oh,
I
y'all.
love the tea. I love the tea.
Paula called her questions convoluted earlier. I don't think she's gonna be offended about that.
Yeah, sorry. What'd you guys rate the book on a scale of 1 to 10? Did you like it?
I thought he was like an asshole.
I also thought so too. But that's kind of like the way that I feel like that's kind of like all the books.
But I think it was because we started with
I
like, a really
I feel
chill
like
like
people
lady, and then we got this, and it was just
Yeah.
like a turnaround.
Isn't he coming to talk to us?
He already did.
He did on last week.
Oh, great.
Yeah.
You didn't miss that much.
was very
Was
nice.
he cool?
He already did.
Like
No.
Alex said, I feel like Bloom was like a lot
like pretty
easier to
good. I really
talk
liked how
to.
she responded to our questions because she was like so sweet about everything. Because like it's so much easier to understand, and it didn't seem like she was talking down to the people she was writing to. Like she wasn't being condescending. Like I know more than you. He kind of wanted to like flex his jargon and kind of flex like like look at all this information I have acquired for you, but like in a very like rude way, if that makes sense.
Well, and I
feel like
think
it was
that's part of the
informative overall. Do some more.
I think that's part of the problem with these Ivy Leagues is they get these people who like are like smart, but like then they like think they know like so much more than like the rest of the world.
Yeah. A lot of it's social cues really. Like I feel like that's like a big thing. And like reading his book, I found it very interesting. I liked Bloom's, but I think I was just a bit more interested in his just because of that multi-part of like his proposals. But I couldn't really get a vibe. Like I just felt like I was just reading kind of a thesis. That was
Yeah.
it. It didn't feel like
Mhm.
personable or anything like Bloom's.
Why was he like low-key angry?
Yeah, I feel like
Like
he
the-
was definitely like the part with Bloom that I liked about her. It was because like she has background in that kind of conservative field, so it's a little easier for her to be more objective and empathetic towards both sides. And I feel like he was just like kind of overly negative.
He was
And
a
like
lot better in person though. Or I
yeah,
mean like on Zoom.
on Zoom, yeah.
Yeah, than his book. Like I thought he was gonna be like a complete jerk, but he wasn't. Like his house was really
I like
cute.
his
Like the
glasses.
background of his room, like I
Yeah.
don't know, like his decorations are nice.
I just liked his glasses. I was doodling them.
Oh, his
Yeah.
glasses were cool, yeah.
Real. Okay, should we depart?
Yeah.
Okay.
Like
Good job,
Bye,
guys.
y'all.
See you in
Tomorrow.
class tomorrow.
everyone.